It was Christmas Eve, and the house was alive with the warm glow of twinkling lights, the scent of roasted turkey, and the hum of holiday chatter. For years, Margaret, had hosted Christmas dinner at my home. It was a tradition I cherished. My table, my rules, my seat at the head, where I could see everyone and feel the pulse of the family I'd nurtured through decades of love and sacrifice. My husband, Tom, had passed 5 years ago, and since then, that seat symbolized my place as the matriarch. It was more than a chair. It was my anchor. This year, my son, Daniel, his wife, Clara, and their 2 kids were joined by Clara's parents, Richard and Evelyn. I'd always had a cordial relationship with Richard, Clara's father, though his pompous air grated on me. He was a retired lawyer who loved to remind everyone of his courtroom victories, often dominating conversations. Still, I welcomed them warmly, as always, setting the table with my finest china and a centerpiece of holly and candles. As we gathered for dinner, I took my usual place at the head of the table, smiling as I watched my grandkids giggle over their cranberry sauce. But before I could even pick up my fork, Daniel stood up, his expression oddly stern. "Mom," he said, his voice cutting through the festive hum, "this seat is for my father-in-law. Move." The room went silent. My daughter-in-law Clara looked down at her plate, avoiding my gaze. Richard, with a smug little nod, adjusted his tie as if he'd been expecting this. My grandkids froze, their eyes darting between me and their father. Evelyn, Clara's mother, gave a nervous chuckle, but no one else spoke. "Excuse me?" I said, my voice steady but laced with disbelief. "This is my table, Daniel." "My house?" Daniel didn't flinch. "Richard's the elder here now, Mom. It's respectful for him to have the head seat. You can sit over there." He gestured to a folding chair squeezed between the kids' high chairs, a spot usually reserved for overflow guests. I felt a hot flush of humiliation. My own son, whom I'd raised, fed, and supported through college and beyond, was displacing me in my own home. For his father-in-law, no less, a man who'd never lifted a finger for our family. I looked at Clara, hoping for a flicker of support, but she busied herself cutting her daughter's turkey. Richard, meanwhile, was already moving toward my chair, his polished shoes clicking on the hardwood. Swallowing my pride, I stood. "Fine," I said, forcing a smile. "Let's keep the peace." I moved to the folding chair, my knees brushing against the table's edge, my back to the wall. As Richard settled into my seat, he launched into a story about his latest golf trip, oblivious to the tension. Daniel and Clara laughed along while I sat quietly, picking at my food. But inside I was seething. This wasn't just about a chair. It was about respect, legacy, and my place in a family I'd built. I'd spent years teaching Daniel to stand up for what's right, yet here he was, undermining me for the sake of impressing his in-laws. I wasn't going to let this slide. Not tonight, not ever. Over the next few weeks, I played the part of the gracious mother. I called Daniel to check in, sent Clara recipes, and even invited Richard and Evelyn over for tea, all while plotting my revenge. It wasn't about petty retaliation. It was about reclaiming my dignity and teaching my son a lesson he'd never forget. I started by gathering intel. I noticed how Daniel and Clara fawned over Richard, hanging on his every word, especially when he talked about his investments or his connections. Clara, in particular, seemed enamored with her father's status, often mentioning how they hoped he'd help them buy a bigger house. Daniel, once my practical boy, had become obsessed with keeping up appearances, especially since Clara's family was wealthier than ours. My first move was subtle. I knew Richard prided himself on his reputation as a financial guru. So I started planting seeds. At a family brunch, I casually mentioned a friend who'd lost a fortune in a shady real estate deal. "It's so sad," I said, glancing at Richard. "She trusted someone who claimed to know the market, but he was all talk." Richard shifted uncomfortably, but Daniel and Clara didn't catch the subtext. I kept at it, dropping hints about experts who overpromise, knowing it would gnaw at Richard's ego. Next, I turned to Daniel's weak spot, his pride in being the man of the family. I knew he felt overshadowed by Richard, so I started praising him excessively in front of Clara's parents, about his job, his parenting, even his grilling skills. "Daniel's always been so reliable," I'd say, watching Richard bristle at being upstaged. This drove a subtle wedge, making Richard compete for attention, which annoyed Clara and put Daniel in an awkward spot. But the real plan was for the next Christmas. I had a year to prepare, and I intended to make it unforgettable. By the time December rolled around, I'd laid the groundwork. I'd spent months researching Richard's past, using my old friend Susan, a paralegal, to dig into public records. She found something juicy. Richard had been involved in a real estate deal years ago that skirted the edge of legality, though he'd never been charged. It was enough to rattle him if brought up strategically. I also worked on Daniel and Clara. I invited them over often, rebuilding our bond. I apologized for overreacting last Christmas, saying I just wanted everyone to feel welcome. Clara softened, and Daniel started confiding in me about the pressure he felt to impress Richard. "He's always talking about his legacy," Daniel admitted. "Clara wants us to live up to that." I nodded sympathetically, filing it away. For Christmas 2025, I announced I'd be hosting again, but this time I'd make it a grand affair. I rented a larger dining table, hired a caterer, and decorated the house like a winter palace. I invited extended family, neighbors, and even some of Daniel's colleagues, turning the dinner into a community event. The head of the table would be a focal point, and I had plans for it. Christmas Eve arrived, and the house was packed. The new table gleamed under a chandelier, and I'd placed name cards at each seat, except the head, which I left unmarked. As guests arrived, I greeted them warmly, paying special attention to Richard, who strutted in with his usual air of superiority. When it was time to sit, Daniel started to steer Richard toward the head of the table, just like last year. But I stepped forward, my voice clear and commanding. "Before we begin, I'd like to say something." All eyes turned to me. I held up a glass of wine, smiling. "This table, this home, has been the heart of our family for decades. It's where we've laughed, cried, and built memories. The head of the table isn't just a seat, it's a symbol of who holds this family together." I paused, locking eyes with Daniel. Last year I was asked to give up my place. I did because I love my family and want peace. But tonight I'm reclaiming my seat, not out of pride, but because I've earned it. I've raised this family, kept it strong, and I won't be pushed aside. The room was silent. Clara's face reddened and Richard's jaw tightened. Before anyone could protest, I continued. "But I'm not here to exclude anyone. Richard, you're a guest in my home and I respect you. So I've made a special place for you." I gestured to a beautifully set chair to my right, decorated with a ribbon and a personalized placard that read, "Honored guest Richard." The crowd murmured approvingly. Richard had no choice but to smile and take the seat, though I could see the irritation in his eyes. Daniel looked conflicted, but he didn't dare challenge me in front of everyone. Then came the final touch. During dinner, I casually brought up Richard's real estate history. "Oh, Richard, didn't you once work on a big development deal in the 90s? I heard it was quite the story." I kept my tone innocent, but Susan, who was among the guests, chimed in, "Oh yes, I remember reading about that. Wasn't there some controversy over the permits?" Richard sputtered, trying to change the subject, but the seed was planted. Guests started asking questions, and his polished facade cracked as he fumbled to explain. Clara looked mortified, and Daniel's face fell as he realized his hero wasn't infallible. As the night went on, I held court from the head of the table, sharing stories of our family's history, including Daniel's childhood triumphs, subtly reminding him of the mother who'd always had his back. By the end of the evening, guests were toasting to me, and Daniel approached me privately. "Mom, I'm sorry about last year," he said, his voice low. "I didn't realize how much it hurt you." I hugged him. "It's not about the chair, Daniel. It's about respect. Don't forget who's been here for you." After that Christmas, things shifted. Daniel and Clara stopped putting Richard on a pedestal, and our family dinners returned to their warm, inclusive vibe. Richard still came around, but he was quieter, his ego deflated. I never gave up my seat again, and Daniel never asked me to. My revenge wasn't about humiliation. It was about restoring balance. I showed my son that respect isn't owed to those who demand it. It's earned by those who build and sustain a family, and I did it all with a smile, a well-set table, and a plan that unfolded like the perfect holiday gift.